The SAS Raid That Changed Warfare. Part 1. The Birth of Legends. Picture this. December 1941. The North African desert. A small group of British soldiers, outnumbered and outgunned, are about to pull off an operation so audacious, so brilliantly executed, that it would rewrite the rules of warfare forever. What they accomplished in a single night didn't just destroy enemy aircraft. It ignited a revolution in military tactics that echoes through every special forces unit in the world today. This is the story of how a handful of brave men became legends, and how one raid changed everything. But before we dive into this incredible tale, if you're passionate about untold stories of British military excellence, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The year is 1940, and Britain stands virtually alone against the Nazi war machine. France has fallen. The Luftwaffe has pummeled London during the Blitz. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps is threatening to sweep across the desert and seize the Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline to its empire. The situation is desperate. Conventional warfare isn't working. Britain needs something different, something revolutionary. Enter Lieutenant David Stirling, a young Scottish officer with the Scots Guards who had transferred to No. 8 Commando. Stirling was no ordinary soldier. Standing 6 feet 6 inches tall, he was known for his independent thinking and his frustration with military bureaucracy. While recovering from a parachute training accident that left him temporarily paralyzed from the waist down, Stirling had time to think. Dangerous thing to do for a creative mind trapped in a hospital bed. What Stirling conceived during his recovery would change the face of modern warfare. He envisioned small teams of highly trained soldiers operating deep behind enemy lines, striking at the enemy's most vulnerable points, their supply lines, airfields, and communications. It was the complete opposite of conventional military thinking, which favored large-scale operations with thousands of troops. But here's the thing that made Stirling's vision truly revolutionary. He wasn't just talking about hit-and-run raids, he was talking about a new philosophy of warfare. Small teams, traveling light, living off the land, using stealth and surprise rather than overwhelming firepower. Each man would need to be worth 10 ordinary soldiers. The selection and training would be brutal. Only the best of the best would make the cut. Stirling's vision was born from careful analysis of what was actually happening in the Desert War. He had observed that large-scale commando raids, while occasionally successful, suffered from a fatal flaw. They required extensive planning, large naval assets for insertion, and hundreds of men to accomplish relatively limited objectives. The larger the force, the harder it was to achieve surprise, and without surprise, casualties mounted. What if Stirling reasoned you inverted the entire equation? What if instead of sending 500 men to destroy an airfield, you sent 5 men to destroy the aircraft? The airfield itself was meaningless, concrete and sand. The aircraft were what mattered. Each Messerschmitt or Junkers destroyed was one less threat to Allied troops and convoys. A small team could slip past perimeter guards, place explosives on parked aircraft, and disappear before the enemy even knew they were there. The concept was elegant in its simplicity, but radical in its implications. It meant abandoning the military's traditional reliance on strength in numbers. It meant trusting small teams to operate independently, often out of contact with headquarters for days or weeks. It meant selecting men not just for their physical fitness, but for their mental resilience and their ability to think creatively under extreme pressure. The British military establishment thought he was mad. Commando units existed, sure, but they operated in large formations. The idea of 4 or 5 men taking on an entire German airfield? Absurd, suicidal, a waste of resources. Stirling heard no from every direction. But David Stirling wasn't the type to take no for an answer. Still on crutches, he infiltrated Middle East headquarters in Cairo, quite literally. Unable to get past the front gate through official channels, he slipped through a gap in the fence and hobbled his way into the office of General Neil Ritchie, the Deputy Chief of Staff. It was one of the most audacious acts of military insubordination in British history, and it paid off. Stirling's passion and his meticulously prepared plan convinced Ritchie. Within weeks, the proposal was on the desk of General Claude Auchinleck, Commander-in-Chief of Middle East Command. Auchinleck saw what others had missed. Britain was losing the conventional war in North Africa. They needed to try something radical. In July 1941, he gave Stirling permission to form a new unit, L Detachment Special Air Service Brigade. The name itself was deception. There was no Special Air Service Brigade. It was a phantom formation designed to make the Germans think Britain had more parachute troops in the region than they actually did. L Detachment started with just 66 men, handpicked by Stirling from various commando and guards units. These weren't just soldiers, they were mavericks, each one selected for their initiative, physical fitness, and their ability to think creatively under extreme pressure.
Among these original recruits were men who would become legends in their own right. There was Paddy Mayne, an Irish rugby international and boxer with a reputation for being as quick with his fists as he was with his mind. Mayne had played rugby for Ireland and the British Lions, representing the pinnacle of athletic achievement, but he'd found his true calling in the commandos. He was known for his physical courage and his sometimes volatile temper, but also for his fierce loyalty to his men and his tactical brilliance. Lieutenant Jock Lewis, a brilliant Oxford graduate and rowing blue, who would develop the special explosive charges that became the SAS trademark. Lewis brought an intellectual rigor to the unit that complemented Stirling's vision. He approached warfare like a complex problem to be solved through analysis and innovation. His invention, the Lewis bomb, was a masterpiece of practical engineering, combining plastic explosive with thermite and oil to create a small, lightweight device that could turn an aircraft into a blazing wreck. There was Reg Seekings, a Fenland farmer's son from Cambridgeshire, who became one of the most decorated soldiers in the SAS. Johnny Cooper, who, at just 19 years old, was one of the youngest members of L Detachment, but whose courage and competence would see him serve with the SAS throughout the war and beyond. Bob Lilly, a tough sergeant who would become one of Paddy Mayne's most trusted raiders. And scores of others, Australians, New Zealanders, Rhodesians, and Brits, all united by their refusal to accept that the war was lost. They came from every background, farmers and factory workers, university graduates and laborers, professional athletes and professional soldiers. What united them was a certain independence of spirit, a willingness to challenge authority when necessary, and an absolute determination to take the fight to the enemy. The training they underwent was unlike anything the British Army had ever seen. Stirling and Lewis pushed these men to their absolute limits. They practiced parachute jumps, which were themselves revolutionary for a unit meant to infiltrate behind enemy lines. The parachute training was particularly dangerous because the equipment was primitive by modern standards. The static lines were unreliable, the canopies prone to fouling, and the landing techniques crude. Men broke bones, dislocated shoulders, and, in some tragic cases, died when their chutes failed to deploy properly. They learned desert navigation using the stars, traveling vast distances with minimal water. In the trackless expanse of the western desert, navigation was life or death. Getting lost meant dying of thirst within days. Stirling insisted that every man be able to navigate using only a compass and the stars. They practiced night after night until reading the constellations became second nature. They learned to estimate distances in the desert where there were no landmarks, to judge terrain from far away, to find water sources in apparently barren landscapes. They trained in sabotage, learning to identify the most vulnerable parts of aircraft and vehicles. Jock Lewis was the master instructor here, teaching them that destruction wasn't about random mayhem. It was about precision and efficiency. Hit the fuel tank and the entire aircraft burns. Hit the cockpit and you destroy irreplaceable instruments. Hit the landing gear and the aircraft can't take off. Every target had its weak points, and every raid needed to maximize damage while minimizing time on target. They studied German and Italian equipment until they could operate it in their sleep. This wasn't just academic knowledge. They needed to be able to start enemy vehicles, operate enemy weapons, even read enemy documents if the opportunity arose.
Some men learned basic German and Italian. They memorized the layouts of different aircraft types, the specifications of various vehicles, the operating procedures of enemy units. But the real innovation was in the mindset. Stirling insisted that every man, regardless of rank, should be able to make command decisions. There would be no rigid hierarchy in the field. If an officer went down, the sergeant would take over. If the sergeant fell, the corporal would lead. This was a radical departure from traditional British military structure, where enlisted men were expected to follow orders without question. The training was brutal. Men collapsed from exhaustion during 100-mile navigation exercises across the scorching desert. Parachute training claimed several lives. The equipment was primitive, and mistakes were often fatal. But those who made it through emerged as something new. Warriors who could operate independently, think creatively, and accomplish missions that seemed impossible. Now, let me ask you something, and drop a comment below with your answer. What do you think makes a Special Forces soldier different from a regular infantryman? Is it physical ability, mental toughness, or something else entirely?
By November 1941, L Detachment was ready for its first operation, or at least Stirling believed they were ready. The mission was ambitious: parachute into the desert, march to 5 different Axis airfields, destroy aircraft on the ground, and rendezvous with the long-range desert group for extraction. If successful, it would cripple German air superiority in the region and prove that Stirling's concept could work. The date was set for November 16, 1941. 55 men would jump, nearly the entire strength of L Detachment. They would be divided into 5 groups, each targeting a different airfield. The weather forecast called for a full moon and clear skies, perfect conditions for navigation, but also for being spotted by enemy patrols. As the men boarded their Bristol-Bombay aircraft at Bagouche Airfield, tension hung thick in the air. Many had never made a combat jump before. Some had only completed a handful of training jumps. The aircraft themselves were old and slow, vulnerable to enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. But these men were volunteers, every one of them. They believed in Stirling's vision, and they believed in each other. What happened next would be recorded as one of the greatest disasters in early SAS history, but it would also plant the seeds for the greatest raid the Desert War had ever seen. The weather forecast was catastrophically wrong. As the Bombays lumbered toward the drop zones, they flew into a massive storm. Winds gusting up to 45 miles per hour battered the aircraft. Rain reduced visibility to almost zero. The pilots struggled to maintain altitude and heading. For the men packed into the fuselage, the turbulence was nauseating. Then came the order, go. The paratroopers jumped into hell. The hurricane-force winds scattered them across miles of desert. Men slammed into the ground at brutal speeds. Parachutes tangled and collapsed. Equipment containers were lost in the darkness. Of the 55 men who jumped that night, only 22 made it back to British lines. The mission was a complete failure. Not a single aircraft was destroyed. For most commanders, this would have been the end. The critics who said Stirling's plan was suicidal seemed vindicated. There were calls to disband L Detachment immediately and return the survivors to their original units. The first combat operation of the SAS had been an unmitigated disaster. But David Stirling saw something different. He saw that the concept was sound, it was the method of insertion that had failed. Parachuting in the desert with its unpredictable weather and lack of landmarks was too risky. But what if they didn't parachute at all? What if they had another way to reach the target? Stirling remembered the Long-Range Desert Group, or LRDG, a reconnaissance unit that had been operating in the deep desert since 1940. The LRDG had perfected the art of desert navigation, using modified trucks to travel hundreds of miles behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence and harassing enemy supply columns. They knew the desert like no one else. What if the LRDG could transport SAS teams to within striking distance of their targets? It was a marriage made in heaven. The LRDG would provide transportation and navigation expertise. The SAS would provide the punch. Together, they would create a new form of warfare that would terrorize the Axis forces and inspire special operations units for generations to come. Within weeks, Stirling had worked out the details with the LRDG commander, Lieutenant Colonel Guy Prendergast. The next raid would be different. They would drive to the target, hit it hard, and disappear into the desert before the enemy knew what had happened. No parachutes, no reliance on weather forecasts, no scattered landings in the dark. The target was chosen, the airfields at Sirte and Tamat on the Mediterranean coast. Intelligence reports indicated that these bases housed dozens of UJ-87 Stuka dive bombers and Me-109 fighters, the aircraft that had been devastating British forces in the desert. Destroy enough of them, and it could tip the balance of the air war. The date was set for December 14, 1941. This time, the team would be small, just 12 men divided into two groups. Stirling would lead one team targeting Sirte. Paddy Mayne, the explosive Irishman who had already proven himself as one of the toughest men in the unit, would lead the other team hitting Tamat. As the LRDG trucks rolled out of Jallo Oasis carrying the SAS raiders, no one could have predicted what was about to happen. They were about to pull off a raid so successful, so perfectly executed, that it would validate everything Stirling had envisioned. They were about to change warfare forever. But that incredible story, the details of how 12 men struck terror into the heart of the Luftwaffe and destroyed dozens of aircraft in a single night, that's what we'll cover in Part 2. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss what happened when these legends slipped into those airfields under the cover of darkness. If you're enjoying this story, give this video a like and let me know in the comments which aspect of the SAS you find most fascinating. And definitely subscribe because Part 2 is coming soon, and it's going to blow your mind. These brave British warriors were about to show the world what true courage and ingenuity look like. Until next time, remember, sometimes the smallest force can make the biggest impact.
Part 2. Night of Destruction. Welcome back. In Part 1, we left our SAS heroes rolling across the desert toward their targets, German airfields packed with Luftwaffe aircraft. 12 men against hundreds of enemy soldiers. What happened next would become the stuff of legend. If you haven't watched Part 1, go back and watch it now. You'll want the full story. And if you're already subscribed, you're awesome. If not, hit that subscribe button because you're about to witness one of the greatest special operations raids in military history. December 14th, 1941. The desert night is cold, a brutal contrast to the scorching daytime temperatures. Two groups of specially modified Chevrolet trucks belonging to the Long-Range Desert Group are grinding across the sand, their engines muffled as much as possible. Inside these vehicles sit 12 men of L Detachment SAS, armed with Lewis bombs, a special explosive device created by Lieutenant Jock Lewis that combines plastic explosive with thermite and oil. One small bomb can turn an aircraft into a burning wreck. David Stirling's group is heading for Sirte Airfield. His team consists of himself, Sergeant Johnny Cooper, and 4 other men. They're armed with Thompson submachine guns, pistols, and enough Lewis bombs to destroy dozens of aircraft, if they can get close enough. Paddy Mayne's group is targeting Tamat, about 20 miles away. Mayne, the Irish rugby player turned warrior, has with him Sergeant Bob Lilly and 4 others. The two groups will strike simultaneously, maximizing confusion and preventing the enemy from reinforcing either location. The RDG drops Stirling's team about 10 miles from Sirte Airfield, just after sunset. The SAS men watch the trucks disappear into the gathering darkness, knowing they won't see them again until the rendezvous point, if they make it that far. Now comes the long march to the target, moving silently through the cold desert night, every man carrying 40 pounds of explosives in addition to weapons, water, and emergency rations. As they approach the airfield perimeter, Stirling orders his men to lie flat and observe. Through binoculars, they can see guard posts, searchlights, and the silhouettes of aircraft parked in neat rows. There are more planes than intelligence had suggested. This is a major Luftwaffe base, not just a forward airstrip. Security is tight. Stirling counts at least 4 guard posts around the perimeter, with patrols moving between them. This is the moment where lesser men would have turned back. The odds are impossible. But Stirling and his team aren't lesser men. They watch, they wait, and they identify a pattern. The guards change every 2 hours. The patrols follow predictable routes. And most importantly, there's a gap, a blind spot between 2 guard posts where the fence can be approached unseen. At precisely 2300 hours, with clouds covering the moon, Stirling gives the signal. The team moves forward in absolute silence. They've practiced this movement hundreds of times in training, a fluid, silent advance where each man is responsible for his own sector, where communication happens through hand signals alone. They reach the fence. It's a simple wire barrier, not electrified, no sophisticated security measures. The Germans never imagined anyone would be crazy enough to attack an airfield this far behind their lines. Wire cutters make short work of the fence. The team slips through, fans out, and begins the approach to the aircraft. This is where the months of training pay off. Every man knows exactly what to do. Approach from the tail section, where you're least likely to be spotted, place the Lewis bomb on the wing fuel tank, set the time pencil detonator for 30 minutes, move to the next aircraft. No rushing, no panic. Methodical, professional, deadly. Stirling himself places bombs on the first 3 aircraft, all UJ-87 Stukas. These dive bombers have been terrorizing British troops for months, their screaming sirens adding psychological warfare to their deadly payload. Not anymore. Johnny Cooper is working down the line of fighters, moving like a ghost between the Messerschmitt 109s. Each aircraft represents millions of Reichsmarks and months of training for its pilot. Each bomb is a small investment that will pay enormous dividends. Then something goes wrong. A guard appears, walking directly toward Johnny Cooper. Cooper freezes, his hand on a bomb he's just attached to a fighter's wing. The guard is 20 yards away, then 15, then 10. Cooper's finger moves to the trigger of his Thompson. If he fires, the entire operation is blown. Every German on the base will come running. The guard stops, lights a cigarette. The match flares briefly, illuminating his young face. He's probably 19 or 20, just a kid from Munich or Berlin, doing a boring guard duty shift on what he assumes is a safe airfield hundreds of miles behind the front lines. He has no idea that death is crouching 10 yards away in the shadows. The guard takes a long drag on his cigarette, looking up at the stars. Cooper doesn't move, doesn't breathe. 30 seconds pass, and eternity. Then, the guard flicks the cigarette away, yawns, and continues his patrol route away from the aircraft. Cooper exhales slowly, heart pounding, and continues his deadly work.
Across the airfield, Stirling has lost count of how many aircraft he's bombed. 10? 12? He keeps moving, placing charges, setting timers. The time pencils are all set for 30 minutes, which means the team has to place all their bombs and be clear of the airfield before the first one detonates. Once that happens, all hell will break loose. 25 minutes have passed since they breached the fence. The team regroups at the extraction point. Every man has used all his Lewis bombs. A quick count suggests they've planted explosives on at least 24 aircraft, far more than they dared hope. Now comes the hardest part, waiting. They can't leave yet because the sound of trucks or any unusual activity might alert the guards before the bombs detonate. They need those explosives to go off while they're still close enough to observe the results, but far enough to escape the inevitable chaos. They lie in a small wadi 400 yards from the airfield, weapons ready, watching the luminous hands of their watches crawl toward the detonation time.
The desert is silent, except for the distant sound of a generator and occasional German voices from the guard posts. Then, at precisely 30 minutes, the night explodes. The first Lewis bomb detonates with a brilliant flash of light. The thermite ignites the aircraft's fuel and a massive fireball erupts into the sky. Before the guards can even react, a second explosion lights up the darkness, then a third, then a fourth. Within seconds, the entire airfield is a scene of apocalyptic destruction. Aircraft are exploding like giant fireworks, fuel tanks cooking off, ammunition detonating in chain reactions. The carefully parked rows of Luftwaffe aircraft are transformed into rows of blazing pyres. The Germans are in complete chaos. Sirens wail, men run in every direction trying to fight fires, looking for attackers, shouting contradictory orders. The explosions continue, 24 in all, each one destroying an aircraft worth more than 100 soldiers' annual pay. The light from the fires can be seen for miles across the desert. Stirling and his men don't stay to admire their handiwork. They're already moving, double-timing it toward the rendezvous point where the LRDG will pick them up. Behind them, Sirte Airfield burns like a vision of hell. But remember, there were two raids that night. While Stirling's team was turning Sirte into an inferno, Patty Main's group was approaching Tomite Airfield 20 miles away. And if Stirling's raid was successful, Main's was about to become legendary. Main's approach to Tomite followed a similar pattern: observation, identification of weaknesses, and silent infiltration. But Maine encountered a problem Stirling hadn't faced. Tomite had better security. The perimeter was more heavily patrolled, and the aircraft were dispersed rather than parked in neat rows. Getting to them all would take more time, and time was the one resource raiders couldn't afford to waste. Maine made a command decision that showed his tactical brilliance. Rather than trying to bomb aircraft across the entire field, he would concentrate his team's efforts on one section, the section that housed the most valuable aircraft. Intelligence had suggested that Tomite was home to a squadron of the new Messerschmitt Bf-110 heavy fighters, twin-engine aircraft that were devastating to Allied bombers. Take those out, and you save countless British lives. The team moved toward the area where the Bf-110s were parked. They placed their Lewis bombs with the same methodical precision Stirling's team had used. But then Maine discovered something that changed his plan. The bombs were running out, and there were still aircraft left untouched. Now, most men would have called it a successful mission and extracted. Maine wasn't most men. He looked at the remaining aircraft and made a decision that would become legendary in SAS lore. He began destroying aircraft by hand. Using his Thompson submachine gun, he shot out cockpit instruments. He climbed onto wings and smashed flight controls. He tore out electrical systems. He was a one-man wrecking crew, methodically rendering aircraft unflyable through sheer physical destruction. When his teammates saw what he was doing, they joined in. It was insane. It was brilliant. It was pure Patty Maine. They were still at it when the Lewis bombs started detonating. The first explosion lit up the night sky, and suddenly the whole airfield was awake. Guards started running toward the burning aircraft. Searchlights snapped on, sweeping the darkness. Maine and his men had seconds to escape before they'd be caught in the open. They ran for the perimeter fence, German shouts echoing behind them. Bullets started cracking through the air, wild shots in the darkness, but deadly nonetheless. Maine paused at defense to provide covering fire while his men got through, his Thompson chattering as he sent bursts toward the pursuing guards. Then he was through himself, and the team was sprinting into the desert darkness with the airfield burning behind them.
The final count for Maine's raid would be recorded as 24 aircraft destroyed, matching Stirling's haul. But the real number was probably higher because several of the aircraft Maine had sabotaged by hand would never fly again, even though they hadn't burned. When both teams reached the rendezvous point and climbed aboard the LRDG trucks, the desert behind them glowed orange from the fires at two different airfields. 48 aircraft destroyed in one night by 12 men. It was unprecedented. It was revolutionary. It proved that Stirling's concept wasn't just viable, it was devastatingly effective. The journey back to British lines took 3 days of hard driving across the desert. The men were exhausted, dehydrated, and filthy, but they were victorious. They had pulled off what conventional military wisdom said was impossible.
They had struck deep behind enemy lines, inflicted massive damage, and escaped without losing a single man. When news of the raids reached Middle East Command, the reaction was explosive. General Auchinleck immediately authorized expansion of L Detachment. The critics who had called Stirling's plan suicidal were suddenly silent. The SAS had proven itself, and the war in North Africa was about to change dramatically. But here's the thing that makes this story even more incredible. This wasn't just about destroying 48 aircraft. This raid changed how the Germans had to fight the entire North African campaign. Suddenly, every airfield, supply dump, and headquarters behind their lines was vulnerable. They had to divert thousands of troops to guard duty. They had to spread their forces thin, protecting targets that had previously been considered completely safe. The psychological impact was enormous. Rommel's forces could no longer assume their rear areas were secure. The raid also validated a completely new approach to warfare. Before December 14, 1941, military doctrine held that you needed overwhelming force to destroy significant enemy assets. After that night, military planners around the world had to reconsider. A small team of highly trained operators could achieve results that previously required battalions. The Americans were watching and learning. When the United States formed its own special operations units, the Rangers, the Marine Raiders, later the Green Berets and Delta Force, they studied the SAS model. The British commando tradition that Stirling perfected would influence American special operations doctrine for generations. So when you hear about Navy SEALs conducting raids in Afghanistan, or Delta Force operating in Iraq, or any Special Forces unit anywhere in the world conducting precision strikes behind enemy lines, you're seeing the legacy of what 12 British warriors did in the North African desert in December 9, 1941. Now, I want you to drop a comment. What do you think was the most crucial factor in this raid's success? The training? The leadership? The innovative tactics? Let me know your thoughts. In Part 3, we're going to explore what happened after this legendary raid, how the SAS expanded, the other incredible operations they conducted, and why this single night's work truly changed warfare forever. We'll also look at how modern Special Forces units around the world still use tactics developed by Stirling and his raiders. Don't miss it. Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. This is a story that every military history enthusiast needs to know. These British heroes didn't just win a battle, they revolutionized how wars are fought. See you in Part 3.
Part 3. The Legacy of Legends. Welcome to the final chapter of this incredible story. In Parts 1 and 2, we witnessed how 12 British warriors pulled off one of the most audacious raids in military history, destroying 48 aircraft in a single night and proving that a handful of determined men could change the course of a war. But what happened after that legendary December night in 1941? How did that one raid transform not just the SAS, but the entire concept of modern warfare? Buckle up, because the impact of what those heroes accomplished is even bigger than you imagine. Before we dive in, if you're loving this deep dive into British military excellence, smash that like button and make sure you're subscribed. We've got more incredible, untold stories coming your way, and you won't want to miss a single one. The morning after the raids, David Stirling and Paddy Mayne stood at Jallow Oasis, watching the sun rise over the desert that had witnessed their triumph. They were exhausted, filthy, and triumphant. Behind them, 48 German aircraft lay in smoking ruins. Ahead of them lay a future they could barely imagine, a future where their small experimental unit would grow into one of the most feared and respected military organizations in the world. The immediate impact of the December raids was seismic. General Auchinleck, already a believer in Stirling's concept, now had irrefutable proof that the SAS model worked. Within weeks, he authorized a massive expansion of L Detachment. The unit that had started with 66 men would soon grow to nearly 400. Volunteers flooded in from units across the Middle East, all wanting to join the unit that had humiliated the Luftwaffe. But Stirling understood something crucial. Bigger doesn't always mean better.
He insisted that the SAS maintain its high standards. The selection process became even more rigorous. The training became more intense. Stirling knew that the moment the SAS became just another commando unit, it would lose what made it special. Every man had to be capable of independent action, creative thinking under pressure, and absolute determination. Only the extraordinary need apply. The raids continued throughout early 1942, and they were devastating. In January, SAS teams hit airfields at Ashidabia and Arco Philinorum, destroying another 30 aircraft. In March, they raided Benghazi Harbor, blowing up ships and fuel depots. In June, they conducted a series of raids along the North African coast that destroyed over 100 enemy aircraft in the space of 2 weeks. The Germans were reeling, unable to predict where the SAS would strike next. Think about the mathematics of this for a moment. Training a Luftwaffe pilot took approximately 2 years and cost tens of thousands of Reichsmarks. Building a Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter required thousands of man-hours and scarce resources. The Germans were losing aircraft faster than they could replace them, not to RAF fighters in the sky, but to small teams of raiders who appeared like ghosts in the night, destroyed everything in sight, and vanished into the desert before dawn. Rommel himself became obsessed with stopping the SAS. He diverted entire battalions to guard duty at airfields and supply depots. He ordered his intelligence officers to find out everything they could about this mysterious unit. He even issued his infamous commando order in October 1942, declaring that captured SAS soldiers should be executed immediately rather than treated as prisoners of war. It was a war crime, a violation of the Geneva Convention, and it demonstrated just how terrified the Germans were of Stirling's raiders. But the SAS was about more than just destroying aircraft. They were demonstrating a fundamental truth that would reshape military thinking. Asymmetrical warfare works. A small force, properly trained and intelligently deployed, can have an impact far beyond its numbers. This principle would become the foundation of modern special operations doctrine. Let me give you a specific example that shows the cascading effects of SAS operations. In May 1942, an SAS team raided a German supply dump near Benghazi. They destroyed fuel trucks, ammunition, and supplies intended for Rommel's Afrika Korps. A week later, Rommel had to postpone an offensive because he didn't have enough fuel for his tanks. That postponement gave British forces time to strengthen their defensive positions. When Rommel finally attacked, he was repulsed. One small raid by a handful of SAS soldiers had influenced the entire strategic situation in North Africa. The Americans were paying close attention. When the United States entered the war, they sent observers to study the SAS in action. These observers were stunned by what they saw. American military doctrine at the time emphasized overwhelming firepower and numerical superiority. The idea that a dozen men could accomplish what required a battalion in conventional thinking was revolutionary.
The lessons learned from the SAS would directly influence the formation of American Special Operations units. The U.S. Army Rangers, reformed in 1942, adopted many SAS tactics and training methods. Marine Raiders studied SAS operational procedures. Years later, when the United States formed the Green Berets and Delta Force, they explicitly modeled their units on the SAS template. The legacy of that December 1941 raid echoes through Fort Bragg, Coronado, and every special operations training facility in America. But let's return to 1942 and the men who started it all. Tragically, not all of them would survive to see the full impact of what they'd created. Jock Lewis, the brilliant Oxford graduate who invented the Lewis bomb, was killed in December 1941 during a raid, just weeks after the successful December 14 operation. His death was a devastating loss, not just to the SAS, but to military innovation worldwide. David Stirling himself was captured in January 1943 during a raid in Tunisia. He spent the rest of the war in Colditz Castle, the notorious German prisoner of war camp for incorrigible escapers. The Germans knew exactly who they had captured, and they made sure Stirling was locked up somewhere he couldn't continue his war. But even in captivity, Stirling's legend grew. He attempted escape so many times that the Germans nicknamed him the Phantom Major. Paddy Mayne took command of the SAS after Stirling's capture, and under his leadership, the unit continued to evolve and excel. Maine led the SAS through the Italian campaign and into Northwest Europe after D-Day. He personally destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other SAS soldier. Some estimates put his total at over 100. He was awarded 4 Distinguished Service Orders, an almost unprecedented achievement. Maine was a warrior in the truest sense, a man who led from the front and inspired absolute loyalty in his men. The SAS fought in every major theater of World War II. They operated in the deserts of North Africa, the mountains of Italy, the forests of France, and even in the jungles of the Far East. They conducted reconnaissance, sabotage, prisoner snatches, and direct action raids. They trained resistance fighters, rescued downed pilots, and gathered intelligence that shaped Allied strategy. By the war's end, the SAS had grown from 66 men to several regiments comprising thousands of soldiers. But here's what really matters. That growth never diluted what made the SAS special. The standards remained impossibly high. The selection process remained brutal. The culture of innovation and independent thinking that Stirling had fostered remained intact. The SAS didn't become just another infantry unit with a fancy name. It remained what it had always been, the best of the best. When World War II ended, there were serious discussions about disbanding the SAS. Britain was exhausted and nearly bankrupt. There were calls to demobilize special units and return to a conventional military structure. For a time, it seemed like the SAS might become a footnote in military history, a wartime innovation that had served its purpose. But the world had changed. The Cold War was beginning. New threats were emerging. Conventional armies, it turned out, weren't always the right tool for the challenges Britain faced in places like Malaya, Aden, and later Northern Ireland. The SAS was reformed in the 1950s, and it has remained a permanent part of the British military structure ever since. Today's SAS still embodies the principles David Stirling established in 1941. The selection process, now known as selection, is considered one of the toughest military training courses in the world. Candidates endure weeks of brutal physical tests, sleep deprivation, and psychological pressure. The pass rate is typically less than 10%. Those who make it through join a unit that operates in some of the most dangerous places in the world, conducting missions that remain classified for decades. The influence of the SAS extends far beyond the British military. When Germany formed its GSG-9 counterterrorism unit, they studied the SAS. When Australia formed its Australian Special Air Service Regiment, they adopted SAS selection and training methods. Israel's Sayeret Matkal, France's GIGN, virtually every elite military unit in the democratic world has been influenced by what David Stirling created in the North African desert.
Even the famous U.S. Navy SEAL Team 6, now known as DevGRU, has acknowledged the SAS influence on their tactics and culture. When American Special Operations commanders write doctrine, they reference SAS operations. When they design training programs, they look at what works at Hereford, the SAS headquarters. The raid on Osama bin Laden's compound in 2011, conducted by U.S. Navy SEALs, used tactics and procedures that trace their lineage directly back to that December night in 1941, when David Stirling's raiders hit those German airfields. Think about that for a moment. A raid conducted 83 years ago by 12 men armed with homemade explosives, established principles that guided one of the most significant special operations missions of the 21st century. That's the true measure of what those warriors accomplished. They didn't just destroy 48 aircraft, they created a template for how modern warfare is conducted. The story of the SAS is ultimately a story about the power of innovation, courage, and refusing to accept that something is impossible. David Stirling looked at a military establishment that said his ideas couldn't work, and he proved them wrong. Paddy Mayne faced impossible odds and succeeded through sheer determination and tactical brilliance. The men of L Detachment volunteered for missions that seemed suicidal and turned them into triumphs. These weren't supermen. They were ordinary British soldiers. Scots, Irish, English, Welsh, joined by volunteers from Australia, New Zealand, Rhodesia, and elsewhere in the Commonwealth. What made them extraordinary was their refusal to accept limitations. They believed they could change the course of the war, and they did. The legacy lives on today. Somewhere right now, SAS soldiers are operating in locations they can't disclose, conducting missions that won't be declassified for years. They're upholding the standards established by Stirling and Mayne. They're proving that a small team of highly trained professionals can accomplish what seems impossible. They're the direct descendants of those 12 men who raided Sirte and Tomet in December 1941. When we talk about military innovation, we often focus on technology, better aircraft, more powerful weapons, advanced communications. But the most significant innovation in 20th century warfare wasn't a piece of equipment. It was an idea that carefully selected, superbly trained individuals operating in small teams can have a strategic impact far beyond their numbers. That idea changed everything. It changed how wars are fought. It changed how militaries recruit and train their elite forces. It changed the balance between massive conventional operations and precision special operations. And it all started with a crazy idea from a Scottish lieutenant recovering from a parachute accident, and 12 brave men willing to bet their lives that his idea would work. So the next time you hear about a special forces operation, whether it's SAS, Delta Force, SEALs, or any other elite unit, remember where it all started. Remember the North African desert in December 1941. Remember David Stirling, Paddy Mayne, Jock Lewis, and the others who proved that sometimes the greatest victories come from the smallest teams. Before we wrap up, I need to ask you, what untold story of British military heroism should we cover next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this 3-part series, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment letting me know what you thought. The story of courage, innovation, and determination continues. There are countless other tales of British and Allied military excellence waiting to be told. Missions that remain classified, heroes whose names have been forgotten, moments that changed history but never made the headlines. Stay tuned to this channel because we're going to bring those stories to light. Who dares wins, the motto of the SAS. 4 simple words that capture everything we've discussed in this series. The men who dared to believe the impossible could be done, who dared to volunteer for missions that seemed suicidal, who dared to challenge conventional military thinking. They won. They won battles, they won respect, and they won a place in history as the men who changed warfare forever. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the greatest military operations in history. Until next time, remember the lessons of the SAS: courage, innovation, and the refusal to accept that victory is impossible. These principles don't just apply to warfare, they apply to life. See you in the next video, where we'll uncover another incredible chapter of military history that deserves to be remembered.